I had been working with a small humanitarian group in Brazil, mapping remote villages along the edge of the Amazon forest in 2019. My name is Alex Turner. I was 29 at the time, and I had spent most of my adult life chasing isolation and raw experiences in nature. This particular trip was supposed to be simple. A week in a remote cabin where we could rest, catalog local flora, and check on some old satellite coordinates. I had imagined peaceful mornings, the smell of wet earth, birds calling, and the slow rhythm of the forest. But that illusion ended the moment we left the last riverbank and entered the thick, suffocating green. The cabin itself was a small wooden structure, abandoned for years, hidden under the canopy, and accessible only by a narrow, muddy trail. Its walls were warped, the roof sagged, and vines had pushed through the windows. Inside, the air was damp and smelled like rot mixed with years of rainwater. We had brought supplies, of course, food, lanterns, and a few tools, but the forest felt alive around us, pressing in, whispering in the wind, and dripping water from every leaf and branch. I woke before dawn on the second day, the sound of rain on the tin roof blending with the distant cries of howler monkeys. I decided to check the surrounding area as part of our routine scouting. My flashlight cut through the thick darkness like a weak torch. The forest floor was uneven, slick with mud and fallen leaves, and every step felt like it could unearth a hidden danger. A hole, a snake, a sharp root. That morning, I stumbled upon something strange about 100 meters from the cabin. Partially hidden under a tangle of ferns and fallen branches, there was a pair of boots, one turned sideways. At first, I thought it was another traveler's discarded items, but the mud around them looked disturbed, and the boots were empty. A cold realization ran through me. This was not random. I crouched, my flashlight trembling in my hands, and traced the area. There were subtle signs of dragging, a trail of broken twigs, faint streaks in the mud that were darker than they should have been. Blood. The thought of a missing person, or worse, made my stomach twist. I checked my radio. Nothing. The group was still asleep, trusting the isolation, the forest, the quiet. I cursed myself for going alone, but curiosity and a sense of duty pressed me forward. I followed the trail deeper into the forest, feeling my way between massive roots and thick undergrowth. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle a potential threat. Sweat poured down my back, mixing with the rain soaking my shirt. After nearly an hour, I reached a clearing. It was larger than I expected, almost unnatural in its openness, the sun breaking weakly through the canopy. And there it was, a body, or what was left of it, slumped against a fallen log. The sight was brutal. Someone had died here, likely weeks ago. The skin was bloated and mottled, flies buzzing, ants crawling over the remains. It was a man, maybe in his late 30s, clothes torn and covered in mud. My stomach churned. I had studied enough field medicine and survival to know the signs. He hadn't survived long in this environment without food, and his injuries were consistent with a fall or attack by wildlife. I froze, taking a deep breath to steady myself. Panic was useless here. The nearest village was hours away, and my only option was to document and report this properly. I snapped a few photos for identification purposes, careful not to touch anything. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the distant splash of rainwater in leaves. But even in that silence, the air felt thick, heavy, and watchful, as if the forest itself had noticed me. As I turned back, retracing my steps, I realized the trail had shifted. Rain had washed some of the evidence away, and I was slipping repeatedly in the mud. Every broken branch I stepped on sounded like a shout in the quiet forest. By the time I returned to the cabin, I was soaked, covered in mud, and utterly exhausted. My hands were shaking as I called the authorities using the satellite phone we had brought. Hours later, A small search and rescue helicopter cut through the fog above the trees, spotting the cabin's tin roof. The crew confirmed the body's location and sent a team to extract it. I stayed back, leaning against the cabin wall, feeling the forest around me and realizing just how fragile human life was in a place like this. The days following were tense. The authorities questioned me repeatedly. The man had apparently been a local guide who had gone missing weeks earlier, trying to transport a group through the forest on his own. His body had been almost impossible to find because the dense foliage and frequent rains hid every trace. The reality hit me like a punch. Even someone experienced could vanish in this forest, leaving nothing but traces that only a sharp eye could catch. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. At night, rain would drum on the tin roof, and every snap of a branch outside made me tense. I knew the forest was alive, but it was indifferent, and its indifference could kill. On the fourth night, I spent hours in the cabin, inspecting every corner, every potential hiding place where wildlife could sneak in. I realized that fear was both a burden and a tool. It made me meticulous, cautious, and alive. When the rescue team finally arrived to pick me up, I left the cabin behind, walking slowly through the mud, trying to commit the path to memory. Even as the helicopter lifted off, I could see the forest stretching endlessly in all directions, dark, dense, and untouched. The incident changed the way I thought about exploration. I had gone looking for solitude and discovery, but I had found mortality in its rawest, most uncompromising form. Weeks later, back in civilization, I couldn't stop thinking about that man. His face, weathered and pale, haunted me. I replayed the path, the moment I first saw the boots, the way the mud had clung to my shoes. The forest was alive in a way most people never experienced, not as a magical place, but as a force that could erase someone without a trace. I realized that our maps, our tools, our preparation could only go so far. Nature didn't negotiate, and it didn't forgive. The experience stayed with me, shaping every subsequent trip I took into the wild. I started carrying extra safety equipment, leaving detailed itineraries, checking the forest floor for subtle signs, and respecting it in a way I hadn't before. The cabin became a mental landmark, a reminder that even when we seek adventure, we are always visitors in a domain that operates on its own terms. Months later, when I finally revisited the satellite photos and notes, I noticed a pattern. The man's body had been near an old river channel, a place where rains often shifted mud and debris, hiding tracks. I traced it carefully, marking every potential danger spot. That pattern helped other local teams find missing hikers in similar conditions. I realized then that even from tragedy, something positive could emerge: knowledge, preparation, survival. I never went back to that exact cabin, but I carry it with me. In my dreams, I sometimes see the trail, the broken branches, the way the rain softened the ground. The forest never felt hostile after that. It simply felt truthful, brutal in its honesty. And perhaps the clearest lesson I took from it was this: the wilderness does not care about our intentions, our plans, or our fears. It only asks that we see it clearly, respect it deeply, and act carefully. Because the moment we forget, it can and will take everything from us. It was the summer of 1997, and I was 23, feeling restless in the monotony of my small hometown in northern Wisconsin. I had been driving aimlessly through the thick, endless forests that stretched between county roads, searching for something, anything, that could break the dull pattern of my life. My old pickup truck rattled and groaned over the uneven dirt roads, the tires crunching on gravel and fallen pine needles. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves, heavy with the sort of silence that made it feel like the world had stopped. I had always been drawn to isolated places, drawn to that edge where the quiet almost felt alive. I stumbled upon it by accident. Half hidden behind a cluster of overgrown shrubs and twisted saplings was a cabin that had obviously been abandoned for decades. The roof sagged in places, the shingles missing, rotting wood exposing the frame beneath. Vines crept up its sides, tangling in broken window frames, and the chimney leaned precariously to one side. I could feel the isolation just by looking at it. There was no path leading up to it, just the faint tracks of deer or raccoons. The kind of place you would expect to see in old photographs but never in real life. Curiosity pushed me to park my truck a short distance away. I grabbed my flashlight and a small backpack with a notebook, a bottle of water, and my camera. My boots sank slightly into the soft ground as I walked through the overgrown brush, the branches snapping underfoot. Even as I approached, the cabin exuded a strange presence, not supernatural, but the kind that makes your skin prick. Every step I took seemed to echo, the forest almost swallowing the sound as if it had been waiting for someone to arrive. The door was hanging off one hinge, groaning when I pushed it. Inside, the air was thick with dust, dampness, and the faint smell of mold mixed with something more metallic, like rusted tools. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I had to be careful with each step. Sunlight spilled through broken windows, casting jagged beams across the interior. The cabin had once been a simple structure, 2 small rooms, a tiny kitchen area, a main living space, but time had reduced it to a skeleton. A collapsed table lay near the corner, a rusted pot on top of it, and an old chair lay on its side, splintered. On the walls, the paint peeled like old paper, curling away in yellowed strips, revealing bare wood. I began exploring systematically. In one corner, I found a stack of newspapers from the late 1950s, yellowed and brittle. The headlines spoke of ordinary things: local fairs, lost pets, high school events. But the smell of the paper, dry and faintly smoky, made it feel like stepping into another era. Drawers in the tiny kitchen were stuck, but prying them open revealed old utensils and a few jars, their contents long gone, leaving only the residue of food that had rotted decades ago. What unsettled me wasn't anything I saw, but what I heard. At first, it was just the wind, whistling through the broken windows and gaps in the walls. But then there were other noises, soft creaks, almost imperceptible shifts in the floorboards above. I realized the ceiling was cracked in several places, beams weakened, sagging. I knew this cabin could collapse if I weren't careful. My heartbeat accelerated, not from fear of ghosts or monsters, but from the tangible danger of falling boards, unstable flooring, and hidden weaknesses that could trap me. I decided to venture into the back room, which appeared to have once been a bedroom. The door frame was crooked, and the door itself barely hung in the hinges. Inside, a small bed frame sat rotting, mattress disintegrated into lumps of fabric and springs. On the floor, a pile of clothes had long since decayed, the remnants of what must have been the occupant's daily life. A small trunk caught my attention. Its lid was rusted shut, but I managed to pry it open with a crowbar I had brought for minor explorations like this. Inside were personal belongings: a few letters, a broken watch, and a faded photograph of a man in his 30s with a serious expression. The more I explored, the more I realized how fragile everything was. The cabin had stood here alone, exposed to decades of storms, snow, and neglect. The walls groaned under their own weight. Dust fell from the ceiling with every step I took. I felt a cold awareness settle in. If I wasn't careful, I could become part of this ruin. As the afternoon light began to fade, the cabin's atmosphere changed. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the temperature dropped, the air thickening with damp and decay. I realized I had lost track of time entirely, absorbed in the fragile details of the space. My instincts screamed at me to leave before it became truly dangerous, but I wanted one last look upstairs. A narrow wooden ladder led to what had once been an attic. Each rung groaned under my weight, and dust plumed into the air with every movement. The attic was small and cramped, the floorboards barely supporting me. Sunlight no longer reached in. Only a dim beam from the broken roof illuminated the space. Old furniture lay scattered. A trunk, a chair, a few boards. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Deep scratch marks along the walls, long and jagged, some reaching the rafters. Not from animals, I realized. They were too high, too deliberate. My mind raced through possibilities, all of them unpleasant. This cabin hadn't just been abandoned. Someone or something had fought against it in desperation. I froze for a moment, my breath loud in my own ears. The floor beneath me shivered under my weight. The attic was too small, the beams too fragile. I realized I couldn't linger here. Every minute increased the risk of injury or worse. Slowly, I made my way down, my hands gripping the sides of the ladder, every step careful, measured. Back on solid ground, I took a deep breath and decided it was time to leave. The cabin's atmosphere, the weight of decades of neglect, the faint evidence of struggle, all of it pressed down on me. But as I stepped outside, the fading sunlight hit the clearing in the forest, and I felt a sense of clarity. I could see the cabin fully now, in its isolation, completely exposed, and yet somehow enduring. I walked back to my truck, careful not to twist an ankle in the underbrush. Once inside, I started the engine, the old truck coughing to life, and drove away slowly. The forest seemed quieter, the wind softer, and the world felt like it was returning to its usual rhythm. As I drove down the narrow dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin looked smaller from a distance, almost insignificant, but I knew it had left something in me. A mix of respect and unease, the kind that comes from facing a place that has endured hardship without complaint. When I finally reached the main road, the cabin was gone from sight, swallowed again by the forest, and I knew I would never go back. But I carried the memory with me. The smell of old wood and dust, the creak of unstable floors, the sense of being alone in a place that had its own silent, stubborn life. It had been scary, yes, but not in the way stories tell you about monsters or ghosts. It was scary because it was real, fragile, and untamed, and for a moment, I had been part of that reality. In the years that followed, I often thought about that cabin. I imagined the people who had once lived there, why they had left, and the decades of exposure that had reduced it to its skeleton. Every time I passed through the northern Wisconsin forests, I would glance at small clearings, half expecting to see it again. But I never did, and somehow that absence made the memory sharper, the experience more vivid. It reminded me that fear doesn't always come from the unseen. It can come from the very real, tangible decay of time, from isolation, and from confronting a place where life had once been and now barely clung on. It was a lesson I carried with me. Respect the world around you, even its ruins, and leave when it tells you to leave. That day, the forest and the cabin had spoken in a language I could understand, and I survived because I listened. The rain had already been falling for most of the afternoon when I reached the edge of the old forest in northern Alberta. The year was 2014, and I had just turned 30. I had been planning this small trip for weeks, wanting to get away from people, noise, and problems that had been piling up back in town. My only goal was simple: find a quiet spot deep in the woods and build a small cabin for myself, something temporary, something just big enough to give me shelter for a few days. I thought it would be peaceful. I thought the forest would calm me down. I had no idea how different the night would turn out once darkness and rain took full control of everything around me. I parked my old truck near a narrow dirt path, the type that looked more like an animal trail than a real road. The ground was soft and patched with puddles. Water dripped from the tailgate as I opened it and pulled out the basic supplies I had brought. A saw, a hammer, a tarp, rope, a small axe, a folding shovel, and enough canned food for 2 or 3 days. The air smelled like wet pine and cold mud, a smell I usually loved, but that day it felt heavier, almost like the rain carried something metallic in it. The sky was thick and dark even though it wasn't late. I walked deeper into the trees until the surrounding woods became dense enough that the sound of the rain changed. In the open, it hit the truck and dirt loudly, but under the trees, it softened into constant tapping on the leaves and branches. I found a small clearing, no more than 10 meters wide, and decided it was the right place to start. I dropped my bag onto a patch of damp moss and took a deep breath, trying to settle myself. My shirt clung to my back from the humidity, and the light wind made the sweat feel cold. Building the cabin was slow work because the ground was already turning to mud. I collected fallen branches, trimmed some with the axe, and dragged them to the center of the clearing. My plan was simple. Take the tarp and stretch it between 2 strong trees and then slowly build up walls around it using logs and thick branches. Nothing fancy, nothing long-term, just something that could keep me dry, warm, and alone for a few days. But as the hours passed, the sky got darker faster than it should have. The clouds were low and heavy, moving in strange patterns as if pushed by different winds at once. The forest quieted. Even the sounds of small animals disappeared. No birds, no insects, not even the distant cracking of branches that usually came from deer. The silence was so complete that I kept stopping and looking around, not because I heard something, but because I didn't. The lack of sound was louder than noise. I kept working because stopping only made me more aware of how quiet everything was. The rain grew harder, changing from a gentle tapping to a steady drumming on the tarp while I pulled it tight and tied it down. The branches I used for the walls were slippery, and my hands were getting numb from the cold. Each breath I took came out in faint white clouds even though it wasn't winter yet. It was around evening when the strange feeling started. I couldn't explain it clearly, but something in the wind changed. The temperature dropped fast, like someone had opened a freezer door in the middle of the forest. The back of my neck prickled. The rain didn't stop, but its sound shifted, like it was hitting different angles or moving sideways. The shadows from the trees grew longer even though the light wasn't bright enough to cast shadows in such a clear way. I kept hammering the makeshift walls, trying not to think about how the forest felt different. Every few minutes I looked over my shoulder, almost expecting to see someone standing there. I knew it was just my mind reacting to isolation and weather, but the feeling stayed. The hair on my arms wouldn't settle down. The woods looked normal, yet every inch of them felt wrong, as if something had shifted slightly out of place. When the structure was finally stable enough for me to get inside, the rain turned into a downpour so heavy it sounded like stones hitting the tarp. I crawled into the small space, which wasn't much bigger than a camping tent, and sat on the wooden floor I had made from broken boards I brought with me. Water leaked from one corner, but most of the inside stayed dry. I lit the small battery lantern and placed it near the wall. Its soft yellow glow gave the place a calmer feeling, but outside, the storm grew violent. The wind slammed against the tarp, bending it inward, making sharp, snapping sounds as the rope strained. I tried to eat something, but the food tasted metallic in my mouth. I wasn't hungry anyway. The sound of the storm wasn't what bothered me most. What bothered me was the sense that something moved beyond the tree line. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear breathing. But every few seconds, the lantern's light seemed to shift along the walls even when the wind wasn't moving. Shadows slid in strange ways, not sharply, just enough for me to notice. I sat still, listening, barely blinking, My heartbeat sounded louder than the rain. I could feel every thump of it inside my chest. The first real sound came late into the night when the storm was at its strongest. It wasn't footsteps or branches breaking. It was a slow, dragging sound on the wet ground, far away at first, then stopping, then starting again a little closer. It reminded me of someone pulling a heavy bag across the mud. I froze completely. The dragging grew louder for a moment, then stopped again. The silence that followed was even worse, so sharp it made my ears ring. I stayed perfectly still inside the small cabin, staring at the wall like a statue. Minutes passed. Then the dragging sound started again, this time moving around the area, slow and uneven. I could picture mud being pulled aside with each movement. My breath became shallow. The lantern gave off a faint buzz. The tarp rustled gently, out of rhythm with the dragging outside. I didn't want to look outside. I didn't want to lift the tarp or peek through the small gap. I felt that if I did, if I gave in to the curiosity or fear, I might see something I wasn't ready to understand. Not supernatural, just real, dangerous, human or animal, something that wasn't supposed to be this deep in the forest on a night like this. After almost an hour, the dragging faded. The storm began to weaken too. The wind calmed, the rain softened, and the woods went back to the same strange silence they had earlier. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the small axe tightly, sitting with my back straight, refusing to sleep even for a second. When the morning finally came, the light outside was gray and cold. I stepped out slowly, expecting to see deep drag marks near the cabin, but the entire clearing was a mess of mud and footprints, my own from building. It was impossible to tell if anything else had been there. The trees were soaked. The air was sharp and cold. The forest looked normal again, almost peaceful. Even though I had planned to stay for days, I packed everything up in less than 20 minutes. The cabin still stood, crooked but solid, the tarp dripping steadily. I left it behind without looking back. The path back to the truck felt longer than it had yesterday. Every sound made me tense. Small drops of water hitting leaves, my boots sinking in mud, the wind brushing against the branches. When I finally reached the truck, my clothes were soaked. My limbs were shaking from the long night, and the feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. It was a feeling I couldn't describe fully, but it stayed with me for a long time. Something had been out there that night. Something real. Something heavy enough to drag. Something slow enough to wait. I drove away without stopping, and by the time I reached the main road, the forest behind me was already fading from the mirrors. I never went back to that clearing again. I never tried to build another cabin in the woods. The memory of that rainy night stayed with me in a way that didn't need names or explanations. It was enough to know what I felt. And the ending was simple and clear. I learned that the forest was not the peaceful escape I had imagined. It reminded me that isolation can reveal things you don't expect, and sometimes the safest choice is to walk away while you still can. I left that cabin behind, the tarp still waving slightly in the morning wind, and I never returned, because whatever moved in that rain was real enough to make me understand that staying would have been a mistake I might not be able to come back from. It was the middle of November 2012 when I decided to take a long drive out into the northern woods of Vermont. I wasn't exactly in the best state of mind. A few months prior, my marriage had ended, messy and cold, and I was still trying to untangle myself from the bitterness and regret that clung like fog to everything I did. My ex-wife, Sarah, had moved on quickly, taking her mother, Ruth, along with her for support, or maybe just out of habit. I wasn't entirely sure which. I didn't have the energy to think about it at the time. I just needed to get away, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could breathe without memories crowding me. I I rented a small cabin through one of those online sites. It was the kind of place tucked away between tall pines and rough, uneven terrain, not exactly marked on any map but still accessible via a narrow, winding dirt road. The cabin was old, built maybe in the 70s, with dark brown logs weathered by years of wind and snow. The windows were small and thick with grime, letting in just enough light to make the shadows seem deeper inside. I remember thinking that the place had a quiet dignity to it, almost like it didn't care about anyone who came or went. That's what drew me in. The first night, I arrived as the sun was sinking behind the hills, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gray. The air was sharp with the cold that comes right before winter fully sets in. I dropped my bags on the creaking floorboards, noting the faint smell of pine sap mixed with mildew. There was a stone fireplace, empty but promising warmth if I could get it going, and a small kitchen with a single gas burner and a dented sink. It wasn't much, but it was enough. By the second evening, the weather had taken a turn. A storm rolled in from the north, dark clouds gathering fast, and rain began tapping insistently against the roof. I sat on a rough wooden chair near the window, watching the trees bend and sway in the wind. The rain made the road back to town nearly invisible. For some reason, I felt both relief and unease about that. Relief because no one could come in here unannounced. Unease because if something went wrong, I'd be completely cut off. It was around midnight when I first noticed something unusual. The wind had died down just enough for the rain to hit the roof in a steady, loud pattern, like the cabin itself was breathing. That's when I saw her, or rather them. Outside the window, under the dim glow of a broken porch light, were two figures moving toward the cabin. My stomach sank as I recognized the shapes. Sarah and her mother. What they were doing here in the middle of a storm, I had no idea. They didn't knock. They didn't call my name. They just came. I remember freezing, gripping the edge of the table as they paused near the porch. Their movements were slow, deliberate, almost hesitant, like they were testing whether someone was home. I wanted to retreat, to hide, to pretend I wasn't there. My mind raced. I hadn't spoken to Sarah since the divorce, and the idea of her mother knowing I was here made it worse. Then, without warning, the porch light went out, leaving them half hidden in the shadows. I pressed my face against the glass, trying to see them clearly, but the rain smeared their shapes. I realized the door was unlocked. I hadn't bothered with locks. I never imagined anyone would come here. A cold knot of panic settled in my chest. I grabbed the old iron poker from the fireplace, more for comfort than anything else, and crept toward the door. The first thing I noticed when I stepped outside was how quiet it had become. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Sarah's mother was standing closer to the edge of the porch, hands gripping the railing, staring at the ground. Sarah herself was just behind her, head bowed, her coat soaked through. I couldn't tell if they were waiting for me or just lost. I said nothing. I didn't want to startle them, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted a confrontation. The air smelled of wet leaves and mud, sharp and earthy, and the wind made the hair on my arms stand on end. I motioned vaguely to the cabin, silently indicating they could come in if they needed. They looked at each other briefly, then at me before moving toward the door. Inside, the cabin felt smaller, more claustrophobic. The storm made the walls groan and the windows rattle. I could see the water dripping from their coats onto the wooden floor. Sarah's mother immediately headed toward the fireplace, as if instinctively seeking warmth, while Sarah remained by the kitchen, wringing her hands. There was tension in the air, thick and heavy, but oddly, it wasn't angry. It was careful, like everyone was navigating a delicate balance. I built a fire in the stone fireplace, the logs hissing and spitting sparks. The room filled with the scent of burning pine, warm and comforting, and I felt the tightness in my chest loosen slightly. They didn't speak, and I didn't either. The storm outside roared, but inside, the silence was only broken by the crackling of flames and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Hours passed. I found an old quilt and draped it over a chair for Sarah's mother, who had curled up in it, exhausted. Sarah sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, staring into the fire. I noticed the tired lines on her face, the way she kept her hands clenched in her lap. She wasn't here to argue or accuse. She was simply present, a reminder of a life I had lost and the quiet ways people move through pain. As the night dragged on, I realized the storm had blown itself out. Rain fell lightly now, and the forest outside was soaked, leaves glistening in a muted gray light. I watched them slowly relax, shoulders dropping, expressions softening. There was an unspoken truce forming in that room. By dawn, I had made coffee on the small gas burner, and we all sat near the fire, drinking quietly. Sarah's mother finally spoke, not to me, but in a way that filled the cabin with her presence, recounting small, mundane details about the roads, the weather, and the forest. It was grounding, oddly soothing, like the storm had washed away not only the mud from the trees, but the weight from our shared past. Sarah smiled faintly at one of her mother's remarks, and I realized I hadn't seen her smile like that in months. When the morning light filtered through the grime-streaked windows, I felt a strange calm. The storm had passed both outside and, in some way, inside. I had faced the unexpected, navigated the tension without confrontation, and we had survived the night together without words of resentment or blame. Eventually, they left, careful not to linger too long, moving back into the forest trail that led to the main road. I watched them disappear into the mist, their figures slowly swallowed by the trees. I closed the cabin door behind them and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. The air smelled faintly of smoke and wet wood, and for the first time in weeks, I felt that the weight on my chest had lifted. I stayed in that cabin for a few more days, alone this time. I explored the forest, walked the dirt roads, and sat by the fire, thinking. The night had been terrifying at first, the presence of my past so close, so unavoidable. But it had ended with a strange clarity. Life moved forward. Pain didn't vanish, but it softened. I could live even if the memories followed. I could breathe even with the shadows of what had been. By the time I left the cabin, I felt different. The road back to town was muddy and slick, but I didn't mind. The forest seemed less oppressive now, almost familiar. I drove slowly, savoring the quiet, knowing that sometimes survival wasn't about fighting storms or ghosts, but simply standing still long enough to let them pass. And when I finally reached the main road, the sun breaking weakly through the clouds, I realized that the night had given me something I hadn't expected. Closure. Not dramatic, not violent, not final in a cinematic way, but real, human, enough. I still remember the weight of the air that night, the way it felt like it never moved, as if the whole place was holding its breath. It was late October of 2019, and I was 31. I had taken a trip to a small rural town on the edge of northern Minnesota, a place I had only heard about from a coworker who said it had cheap cabins and empty lakes if someone wanted peace. I didn't know what kind of peace he meant, because when I arrived, the land felt silent in a strange, heavy way. Not peaceful, just empty. When I checked into the small rental cabin, the man who handed me the keys told me it sat near an old graveyard from the late 1800s. He said the graves were hard to find now because the land around them had shifted over the years. I didn't care much at the time. I only needed a quiet place for a few days. The cabin looked like something someone had built decades ago and then left mostly untouched. The wood siding was gray and dry, the kind that cracked if you pressed your thumb against it. Inside, The place smelled like dust that had been sitting in one place for years. The air was cool even when the heater clicked on. The bed sat in the corner with a thin mattress that sagged in the middle. A small window faced a line of trees, and past those trees, somewhere in the brush, was the old graveyard the man mentioned. I didn't think I would end up near it, but things never go the way I expect. The first night was quiet. Too quiet, actually. I could hear every little thing. My own breathing felt loud. When I stepped outside to get fresh air, the woods looked darker than anything I had seen before. The moon wasn't strong enough to cut through the branches, and the ground felt soft with layers of dead leaves. I stood on the small porch and listened. Nothing. No wind, no insects, no animals moving through the brush. It felt like the whole forest had emptied out just for me. The next morning, the sky stayed cloudy, and the air felt colder. I took a walk behind the cabin, moving through the trees out of curiosity. The ground dipped in places, creating uneven pockets of dirt that looked disturbed. I didn't realize until later that these dips were where the old graves sat. The wooden markers had long rotted away, and whatever metal plaques once marked them had sunk deep into the soil. I walked carefully, but the land felt soft in a way that made me nervous, as if the ground wasn't stable. There was an old cabin deeper in the woods, maybe 100 yards past the graveyard area. I didn't see it the first time I walked through, but on the second day, I caught a shape standing between the trees, dark, square, and crooked. It looked like a hunter's cabin or a shed, something someone used long ago and then abandoned. The roof sagged heavily on one side. A small window near the front was cracked, and the wood was darker than the wood on my cabin, like it had soaked up every memory of the forest. I didn't want to get too close at first, but something about it pulled my attention. Maybe it was the way it didn't match the rest of the land. Everything else around me was natural. Trees, dirt, rotting leaves. But this building felt out of place, like a leftover piece of someone's life. I walked around it slowly, not touching anything. The ground near it felt even softer, as if something had been dug up or dragged through at some point. The trees around it leaned inward slightly, almost as if they were trying to hide it from anyone who passed by. That night, something changed. I woke up around 2 in the morning because something hit the side of the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to get me out of bed instantly. The air inside the cabin felt colder than it had earlier. When I stepped onto the porch, I didn't see anything. The trees were still, but the sense of emptiness that had been there before now felt replaced with something else. Something watchful. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to sleep again. But every few minutes I felt like something was moving outside, right past the window. There was no sound, but there was this pressure in the air, like the kind you feel when someone stands too close behind you. I stayed awake until the sky finally turned gray. The next day I told myself I imagined it, that maybe a branch fell or an animal bumped into the wall. But I didn't believe my own excuses. I kept thinking about the old cabin deeper in the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever disturbed my sleep had come from that direction. I shouldn't have gone back, but I did. The air near the old cabin smelled different, like damp soil mixed with something metallic. The ground in front of the door looked messy, as if someone had been standing there repeatedly or pacing back and forth. The deeper I examined the ground, the more I noticed something strange. The footprints, if that's what they were, weren't spaced like a person's steps. They were uneven, too far apart in some places and too close in others, almost as if whoever made them didn't walk normally. I circled around the back. That's when I noticed a thin line of disturbed dirt leading from behind the cabin straight toward the graveyard area. Something had been dragged or moved along that line. The shape in the dirt looked long and narrow, like someone pulled a heavy object behind them. My stomach tightened. I didn't know why, but something about that trail made me feel like the land itself didn't want me there. That night, everything finally made sense, but not in a way that brought relief. It was more like fitting pieces together only to realize the picture was worse than you imagined. I heard something again outside the cabin. Not a hit this time, something walking. The steps were slow at first, too heavy to be a small animal, but too soft to be a person stomping around. They circled the cabin once, then stopped near the back window. I didn't move. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, breathing as quietly as I could. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves, then a long pause, then more steps, as if something was deciding whether to get closer. When I gathered enough courage to look outside, I caught a shadow moving between the trees. It wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. It was a person, a real person, but the way he moved was wrong. His steps were slow and deliberate, like he was dragging one leg. His clothes were dark and dirty, blending with the woods. I watched him for a few seconds until he disappeared behind the trees, heading straight toward the old cabin. My heart hammered so hard I could barely breathe. I realized then what was happening. Someone had been living out there, hiding in that old cabin, using the graveyard area for whatever reason someone like that would. Maybe he had been there for years, tucked away far enough that no one bothered with him. Maybe the disturbed ground wasn't just shallow old graves. Maybe he had been using the land for something else, something I didn't want to imagine. The dragging trail behind the cabin, the odd footprints, the hit on my cabin wall, they all came from him. He wasn't supernatural. He wasn't a ghost or a monster. He was a man who shouldn't have been living in those woods anymore, someone who didn't want people near him. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The moment the sky lightened, I packed everything, grabbed my bag, and left the key on the small table. I didn't look back when I walked to my car. I didn't look at the trees or the trail leading deeper into the woods. I drove away as fast as the old road allowed, and I didn't stop until the town was far behind me. Even now, years later, I think about the way the man moved between the trees and how silent he was. I think about the old cabin and the disturbed ground around it. I think about how easily I could have walked up to it at the wrong moment. And I think about how close he must have been that night when he circled my cabin and stood near the window. The ending is simple. I got away. Nothing followed me. Nothing chased me. I never went back to that town, and I never bothered to ask anyone about the old graveyard or who might still be living out there. I know what I saw. I know it was real. And I know that if I had stayed even one more night, I might not have walked out of those woods at all. That place wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by something far more real. A man who hid in the shadows of forgotten graves, waiting for the world to forget he existed. I made sure I never gave him a reason to notice me again. I was 34 when I decided to take a short break from work and spend a few days alone in a small cabin on an old farm in rural northern Missouri. It was early October of 2019, the kind of time when the weather shifts from warm afternoons to cold nights without warning. I had been stressed for months, and the idea of quiet fields, open sky, and a place where the only sounds were wind and insects felt like something I needed. The farm belonged to a distant cousin I barely knew, and the small cabin stood at the far back of the property, away from the main farmhouse, down a dirt path lined with tall grass and broken fences leaning at tired angles. The cabin was simple, built in the late 1960s, with a metal roof that rattled lightly whenever a breeze passed. The wood walls were dry and cracked, smelling like old dust and pine mixed with a faint hint of smoke from all the winters it had once been used. There was a small kitchen area with an old stove that probably belonged in a museum, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a single table pushed against a window, and a rusty propane heater that looked like it could decide to stop working at any moment. I didn't really care. I wasn't planning to stay inside much. I wanted the quiet outside more than anything. On the first day, everything felt peaceful. The farm stretched wide in all directions, full of empty fields, dead corn stalks from the previous harvest, and long dirt tracks marked with deep tire grooves from old tractors. I walked around, took pictures, and breathed air that tasted colder and cleaner than anything back home. At noon, I saw a few cows far off near a fence, barely moving, their shapes dark against the dull brown of dying grass. Nothing felt dangerous or strange. It was quiet in a way that made your thoughts feel louder. But the second night changed everything. It was around 8 p.m. when I first felt something was wrong. The sky was already black. Not the soft city night kind of black, but a hard one that swallowed everything past the porch light. I sat inside the cabin with a small lantern lit, reading an old magazine I found in a drawer. The wind outside had picked up, brushing against the metal roof, making it vibrate in a slow, steady rhythm. It wasn't scary at first. It was just the sound of being isolated. But then, I felt a faint tremor under the floorboards. Just once. Then again, heavier, almost like someone taking slow steps somewhere outside the cabin. The cabin was small, and the ground around it was stiff and covered in dry dirt and patches of flat grass. Everything around it usually stayed still. The wind alone couldn't make the floor move. I lowered the magazine and sat in complete stillness, trying to decide if I imagined it. I felt another step, slow, heavy, purposeful, not an animal moving lightly through leaves, not wind knocking something around. It was weight sinking into ground, pressing vibration through wood. I stayed still, not daring to breathe too deep. There were no windows on the side where the steps came from, only the narrow front window. The porch light outside was dim, more orange than white, and it barely covered anything past a few feet. The rest of the world outside was thick darkness. Another step, closer. My mouth felt dry. A farm could have wandering animals, stray dogs, coyotes, even a big deer. But the steps seemed too slow and spaced out, like the stride was long, and too heavy. Most animals move faster or more unevenly. I stood up, moved toward the table, turned off the lantern, and waited in the dark, letting my eyes adjust. The house felt colder without the lantern. The shadows on the walls thickened. I remembered that the only lock on the cabin's door was a small metal latch that looked older than I was. After maybe 10 seconds of silence, I heard the steps again, but now they came from the front, somewhere past the porch. They were close enough that the wood under me had a faint shiver each time. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel the pulse behind my eyes. I didn't want to go near the window, but I didn't want to sit blind either. I leaned slowly, just enough to look out the right edge of the front window. The porch light flickered slightly from the wind. The dirt space in front of the cabin was empty, completely empty, just shifting grass and shadows from the nearby trees. Then I noticed something. The fence about 40 feet out had a break in it, a long gap where the boards were pushed inward, not outward. It looked recent, a fresh break, the wood edges pale where the surface had cracked. I was sure it wasn't broken earlier. I had walked past that same fence in daylight and would have noticed a hole that size. As I stared at it, I felt the steps again, but this time on the side of the cabin where I had no window view. It was the slow circle of something moving around the structure. The pressure of the steps felt too controlled, almost like whatever was out there wasn't wandering but checking, inspecting, pacing around the walls like it knew exactly where the weak spots were. My breath turned shallow. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps stopped right beneath the window, not in front of it, not far from it, directly under it. I kept about a foot of space between me and the window, staying low, pressing my shoulder against the wall. I didn't want a shadow to cross the glass. My legs trembled from trying to stay still. The wind pushed against the cabin, and the roof groaned softly. The silence outside, aside from the wind, felt unnatural. No insects, no rustling leaves, nothing alive but whatever stood under the window. After a moment that felt like 20 minutes, The steps moved again, very slow, moving toward the back of the cabin. I heard them fade slightly but not fully disappear. I didn't know if it stopped behind the cabin or moved farther into the field. I stayed frozen until my knees hurt from crouching. Then I forced myself to reach for my phone. No service. Not even one bar. It didn't surprise me. I already knew the reception here was awful, but the red "no signal" warning felt heavier now. I waited until I was confident the thing or person, or whatever it was, wasn't right outside anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed frame, the lantern off, the cabin cold, my body stiff with tension. Every small sound made me flinch. The hours dragged, slow and miserable, until the faint gray of morning touched the window. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside slowly, my legs weak. The wind had calmed, and the world looked normal again, with long shadows stretching from trees and the smell of cold soil rising into the air. But the normal look only made what I found feel worse. There were footprints around the cabin. Not boot prints, not animal tracks. They looked like bare human prints. Long, narrow, deep into the soil, spaced wide apart like the person who made them had a strange stride. There were at least a dozen around the cabin's perimeter, some right under the window, exactly where I felt the steps. The dirt was crushed so hard that the prints looked like someone pressing down with full weight, heel first, then dragging toes lightly at the end of each step. The prints went toward the broken fence, and past it, into the tall grass. I didn't bother packing properly. I grabbed my bag, shoved half my things inside, got into my car, and drove straight back up the dirt path toward the main road. When I reached the farmhouse, I saw my cousin's truck but didn't stop. I didn't want to explain anything. I didn't want to talk at all. I just kept driving until I reached a paved road and then kept going for hours until I reached town. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked about the broken fence or the strange tracks. I didn't want to hear any explanation that would make me replay that night again. To this day, what scares me most is not knowing who or what walked around that cabin, slow enough to let me hear every single step. What scares me more is knowing that whoever made those prints had been watching the cabin long enough to approach it without making even one sound until they wanted to. And what scares me the most, even now, is realizing that nothing stopped them from trying the door. Nothing stopped them except the fact that, for some reason, they simply didn't. I never planned to spend that entire autumn alone in the mountains of northern Arizona, but sometimes life pushes you in strange directions. In late 2019, I had taken leave from work after months of stress that was eating me alive. I thought a few quiet weeks in a rented hunting cabin would help clear my head. I found the place through a friend of a friend, a narrow wooden structure built in the late 70s, hidden among tall pines near a dry creek bed. It sat almost an hour away from the nearest small town, and the rough dirt road leading to it made every trip feel like crossing into another world. I was 32 at the time, tired, burnt out, and craving silence. The cabin seemed perfect. No neighbors, no cars, no phones ringing. Just trees, cold air, and my own thoughts. On the drive up, I felt a strange mix of relief and tension. The kind that comes when you're stepping out of your normal life and into something you know you won't be able to easily walk away from. Still, I pushed those nerves down. I told myself I needed this. The first 2 days were peaceful. I spent my mornings gathering firewood and my evenings sitting on the small back porch, watching the forest darken. The air smelled like dry soil and pine sap, the kind of smell that usually calms you. But on the third night, things shifted. It started when I heard something moving around the tree line behind the cabin. The sound was too soft to be a deer, too long to be just a branch falling. It kept stopping and starting, like whatever it was testing how close it could get without revealing itself. I stayed still on the porch, holding my breath as the cold crept up my spine. Even then, I didn't panic. Wild animals wandered near cabins all the time, but the longer I listened, the more the sound bothered me. It wasn't the footsteps themselves. It was the timing. They paused for too many seconds at a time, almost as if whoever or whatever was out there was waiting for my reaction. I sat outside until the cold drove me back in, and I told myself to forget it. But that night, I barely slept. Every time the wind picked up or a pine cone dropped onto the roof, I jolted awake. I wasn't used to the deep, empty forest silence. It felt unnatural, too quiet for such a wide space. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt behind the cabin. They were shaped like animal prints but uneven, almost as if they were made by something trying too hard to look like an animal. The toe shapes were off and the gait was inconsistent. Some prints were spaced normally, and others were stretched too far apart. I stood there staring at them for a long minute, feeling a heavy pressure in my chest that no amount of logic could settle. That day, I tried to stay busy. I chopped wood, cleaned the inside of the cabin, checked the little generator, anything to quiet the creeping anxiety. But the forest surrounding the cabin felt different now. Every shadow seemed to hold a shape. Every gust of wind felt like breath against the back of my neck. I kept telling myself I was letting my imagination take over, but it didn't help much. By late afternoon, I decided to take a short walk down to the creek bed. I stuck close to the property line, following the narrow path that wound between tall pines. The forest floor was covered in dry needles that cracked under my boots. For a while, the walk helped clear my head. The quiet started to feel peaceful again. I even sat for a few minutes on a fallen log near the creek, watching a thin line of water slowly roll over the rocks. But that peace didn't last. I was halfway back to the cabin when I noticed something between the trees. At first, it looked like a person crouched low behind a cluster of bushes, but when I blinked, it was gone. I stood frozen, staring at that spot until my eyes burned. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe not. I didn't wait around to find out. I walked quickly, forcing myself not to break into a run. When the cabin came into view again, I felt relief wash over me, but only for a moment. The front door was partly open. I knew without a doubt that I had shut it tightly that morning. The lock wasn't broken, the frame wasn't damaged. It was just open, as if someone had gently pushed it. Inside, nothing looked disturbed. Nothing stolen, nothing knocked over, nothing touched. But the air inside the cabin felt different, almost subtly warmer, as if a person had been there just moments before I arrived. It was the kind of small change you can't describe but instantly notice. That night was the worst so far. The usual soft steps near the tree line turned into slow circles around the cabin. Whatever was out there wasn't hiding anymore. I could hear it walking from one wall to the next, dragging something lightly through the dirt. Not a heavy drag, just enough to scrape. Enough to make sure I could hear it. I didn't turn on any lights. I stayed still in the dark, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, listening with every muscle in my body locked in fear. My heartbeat was so loud that it drowned out the softer sounds, leaving me unsure of what was real and what wasn't. Hours passed like that, until the steps finally faded and the forest returned to silence. By morning, I was exhausted. My hands were shaking as I made coffee. I tried to eat but couldn't. Every sound outside felt sharper, closer. I knew I needed to leave. I told myself I would pack my things and head down the mountain as soon as the sun was fully up. But before I could do that, I found something new. On the porch railing, smeared in dry dirt, was a handprint. Not an animal track. A human handprint, long fingers, slightly crooked, pressed hard enough that the dirt stuck to the wood. There was no doubt now. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been circling the cabin at night. Someone had come close enough to reach the porch. The fear I felt in that moment was heavy and cold. Settled deep inside me, not the kind you can push away. I didn't pack up slowly. I shoved what I could into my backpack, grabbed my keys, and left the rest behind. The cabin could rot with all of it inside for all I cared. The road out was rough, and the forest around me felt tighter than ever, almost suffocating. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone running behind my truck, but the road stayed empty. When I finally reached the main highway, it felt like breaking the surface after being underwater for too long. I never went back for the rest of my things. I never contacted the owner. I didn't want any connection to that place again. But for weeks after, I kept checking my windows at night. I kept feeling like someone was standing just out of sight. That handprint on the railing burned into my memory. The uneven tracks behind the cabin. The soft steps circling the walls. For a long time, I tried to explain it away. Maybe it was a hunter playing some sick joke. Maybe it was someone living off the land who didn't want me there. Maybe it was just a person pretending to be something else. People online like to throw around the word skinwalker when they don't understand something. But what terrified me most was knowing it wasn't some creature from a story. It was a real person, someone who had been close enough to study me, close enough to enter the cabin, close enough to leave a handprint almost the size of mine. A real human who walked around my cabin for 3 nights, slowly, patiently, like they were waiting for the right moment. What I saw in the trees that afternoon wasn't supernatural. What I heard circling the cabin wasn't a monster. It was a person. Someone who understood the forest better than I ever could. Someone who knew how to move like an animal, how to watch without being seen. And the worst part is that I'll never know what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. I left that mountain behind, but the thought still sits in the back of my mind whenever the night grows too quiet. Some people hide in the forest because they don't want to be found. Some people learn to mimic the things that live there. Some people let the darkness shape them into something impossible to understand. And sometimes, when you're alone in a cabin miles from anyone, you don't need ghosts or legends to feel fear. A single pair of human eyes watching from the trees is enough. Because humans can be far more terrifying than anything people make up in stories. I had been looking forward to that week in northern Maine for months. It was the fall of 2014, and I was 27, eager to escape the constant hum of city life. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a small, weather-beaten structure tucked into the pines near Baxter State Park. I had rented it through a friend of a friend, who insisted it was perfect for hunting season. Remote, quiet, and with enough space for a few hunters to stay overnight. The first day was easy. I unloaded my gear, carried it through the thin dusting of orange leaves, and got the cabin ready. It had the essentials: a propane stove, a small fridge, and a wood-burning fireplace. The floorboards creaked in certain spots, and the windows rattled slightly when the wind gusted, but it felt like a proper escape. I stacked firewood outside, inspected the perimeter, and noted the tracks of deer and other wildlife near the clearing. I had planned to hunt early the next morning, but that evening, I decided to take a short walk around the nearby woods. The forest smelled damp, earthy, and sharp with the scent of pine needles. My boots sank slightly into the soft ground, wet from overnight dew. As I moved deeper, the light dimmed quickly, though the sun was still on the horizon. Shadows thickened among the trees, and I kept imagining movement just out of the corner of my eye. I shook it off, blaming nerves and the isolation. Returning to the cabin, I noticed a set of prints in the dirt near the side door, smaller than mine, but too human to be deer. I paused. They didn't match anything I had seen on the way in. I chalked it up to another hunter, maybe someone else renting in the area. The thought made me uneasy, but I didn't dwell on it. Night fell fast. I lit the fireplace, the flames casting long, flickering shadows across the room. Outside, the wind whistled through the trees, sometimes sounding like distant voices carried across the clearing. I checked my rifle and cleaned my boots, hearing every creak in the cabin as though the building itself were alive. I slept in the small loft, which was accessible by a ladder against the wall. The mattress was thin but tolerable. Despite my fatigue, sleep was fitful. I woke several times, sure I heard footsteps crunching through the underbrush, though every time I checked, nothing was there. The next morning, I got up early, the sky a soft gray through the window. I packed lightly, carrying only what I needed for a half-day hunt. I moved quietly, trying not to scare any game, and followed deer tracks that led deeper into the forest. The air was cold, sharp, and clean. I spotted a buck and followed it for some time, careful not to make noise. Eventually, I took the shot. It was clean. The adrenaline and satisfaction were brief. I knew I had to return the deer to the cabin and dress it properly. When I returned, the cabin didn't look right. The front door, which I had locked that morning, was slightly ajar. My stomach sank. I approached slowly, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the treeline. Inside, everything looked untouched, but then I noticed something subtle, something on the floor near the fireplace. It was a small, folded scrap of paper. I picked it up, scribbled on it in hurried, almost childish handwriting were the words, asterisk, I see you. Asterisk, the hair on my neck stood on end. I knew the nearest neighbors were miles away. No one should have been here. I checked the locks, double-checked the windows, and even set the deer down outside temporarily to inspect the perimeter. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I noticed something else. More prints, smaller, human-shaped, leading from the treeline to the cabin and back into the woods. Whoever it was had been circling the cabin, watching me. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone. No service. Of course, there was no service. I spent the rest of the day on high alert, moving carefully as I prepared the deer and stocked firewood. Every sound, the snap of a branch, a rustle in the leaves, made me flinch. By evening, I decided to barricade the door with a sturdy chair and stay on high alert. I kept the rifle by my side and slept lightly on the loft mattress, hearing every movement outside. At around 2 in the morning, I woke to something that made my heart slam against my ribs. It wasn't footsteps, not exactly, but a low, deliberate scratching at the cabin walls, like someone testing the structure for weaknesses. My mind raced. This wasn't some prank. It was deliberate, someone experienced at moving silently. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting. The scratching stopped. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted off again, only to wake to the faintest whisper of movement at the edge of the loft ladder. Dawn broke, and I knew I couldn't stay. I packed everything I could carry and prepared to hike out immediately. The forest seemed to close in on me, the shadows long and twisting. As I moved through the trees, I noticed signs of someone following me. More prints, now in the soft mud, always just a little behind mine, never intersecting, just tracking. I increased my pace, heart pounding. I reached the dirt road that led to the main highway. My car was still there, untouched. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. That's when I saw it. Figures among the trees, standing just at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't make out faces, just tall, thin silhouettes, perfectly still. They didn't run as I drove past. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I kept driving until I reached a town with a gas station and a working phone. I called the sheriff. He didn't dismiss me, but there was nothing he could do without evidence. They checked the area a few days later, found the prints, and noted signs that someone had indeed been living in the woods near my cabin. No one was ever caught. I returned home, but I didn't sleep well for months. Eventually, I went back to Maine years later, curious but cautious. The cabin was gone. removed after a new owner complained about trespassers and damage. The forest had reclaimed the clearing, leaving only a memory of a place that had once felt like safety but had been anything but. I learned to trust my instincts after that trip, the way every rustle and shadow could mean danger. I still hunt, still explore remote cabins, but I never stay alone anymore, and I always check the perimeter, doors, and windows more than twice. Even now, years later, I can remember the silence of that forest at night, the weight of being watched, the way someone could move unseen just beyond your vision. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't fairy tale. It was real, and it left a mark I'll never forget. I was 31 in the autumn of 2017 when I drove out toward a quiet stretch of northern Manitoba, a place I had only seen on a map and in a few blurry photos online. The cabin I booked stood on a piece of land that looked forgotten, surrounded by old pine trees that leaned like tired men and a lake that didn't seem to have a name. I chose it because I wanted a week away from work and city noise. My head felt crowded, and I thought that silence would help me breathe again. I didn't plan anything unusual. I only wanted to sit by the water, read a little, and sleep more than I had been able to for months. The long road toward the area was almost empty. I saw only a few trucks, and the air looked heavy, like it carried cold rain inside it. The sky had that late autumn gray that makes everything look slightly older than it is. My car felt small as the forest thickened around the route. I saw fewer signs, fewer houses, and after a while, no houses at all. Just trees, mud, and the feeling that the place didn't see many people. When I reached the dirt path leading to the cabin, I slowed down. Branches scraped the sides of my car, and mud splashed up the doors. The path twisted deeper than I expected, and I kept glancing at the GPS until it lost signal, leaving me with nothing but a weak compass icon. The cabin finally appeared and looked exactly like the kind of place someone would forget existed. Dark wood, chipped paint, half-broken steps, and a roof that sagged slightly on the left side. The trees around it were tall and close together, leaning in like they were listening. I parked, stepped out, and immediately smelled damp earth mixed with old pine needles. The cold air stung my skin in a way that made me feel more awake. The door of the cabin groaned when I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like dust, old firewood, and something slightly sour, like wet clothes left in a bag too long. The place had a small kitchen, a single bedroom, a metal stove, and a table with scratches carved into the surface. I dropped my bag on the bed and started opening windows to let the air change. By late afternoon, the light outside grew softer. I walked down toward the lake, stepping over fallen branches and patches of soft ground that made my shoes sink in a little. The lake was calm, and the surface looked smooth enough to be mistaken for glass. I stayed there until the sun dropped behind the trees. A stillness settled around the area that didn't feel peaceful. It felt too heavy, like the land held its breath. Back inside the cabin, I set up a fire in the stove and heated a can of soup. The heat warmed the room slowly, pushing away the cold pockets hiding in corners. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting toward the windows. Outside, everything looked too dark. I kept noticing small movements in the edge of my vision, like shadows shifting between the trees, though I kept telling myself it was wind or animals. The first sign that something was wrong came when I went to brush my teeth. As I leaned over the small bathroom sink, I noticed the window was slightly open. I was sure I had closed all of them earlier, but I tried not to overthink it. Maybe I missed that one. I shut it tight, locked it, and went to bed. The wind picked up that night, making the cabin crack its old bones. The sound of branches scratching the walls came and went in uneven patterns. I lay still in the darkness, staring at the ceiling. Then I heard something else, something too controlled to be the wind. a soft thud on the porch. Not loud, but solid enough to make my heart jolt. I tried to stay rational. Animals walk on wooden porches. Raccoons, stray dogs, even deer sometimes wander closer than you expect. But the thud came again, heavier, measured, not the confused, clumsy steps of an animal. I stayed in bed, breathing slowly, waiting. After a few long seconds, another sound followed. Not steps, more like the faint drag of something being pulled across the porch. My body tensed as I imagined all the things it could be. I forced myself to stay calm, thinking again about animals carrying objects or scraping antlers against the wood. I didn't move until the noises stopped completely. The next morning, everything looked normal again. The porch showed no clear marks. The trees didn't lean differently. The air even seemed brighter. I ate quickly, walked around the area, tried to reset my nerves. But while walking near the tree line behind the cabin, I saw something that didn't fit. A piece of torn fabric stuck to a branch, hanging low. It looked like part of a jacket, dark, thick, and dirty. I didn't touch it. Something about it made me step back. I scanned the ground and noticed the soil looked disturbed, like someone had walked there recently, but not in a straight line. More like they paced around or moved irregularly. That afternoon, clouds built over the lake. A cold wind swept across the area, and the woods felt even more silent than before. I stayed inside the cabin, reading and warming myself near the stove. Every so often, I would hear a soft creak outside, but I tried not to react. The hours felt long, slow, stretched thin. Night came again, darker and heavier. I kept a flashlight near the bed. I thought I wouldn't sleep at all, but my body eventually gave in. I don't know how long I slept before the new sound woke me. A sharp bang, not on the porch this time, against the wall behind the bedroom. It was sudden and hard, like someone hit the side of the cabin with something solid. My entire body froze, couldn't even swallow. Then came another bang lower down. Then a slow scrape moving along the wall, dragging toward the window. My breath grew shaky. The window was only a few feet from where I slept. I stared at it, expecting something to appear in the dark glass. Nothing did, but the scraping continued, slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever was outside wanted me to know they were there. I stayed completely still until the sound faded. It didn't fade in a natural way. It stopped suddenly, as if the person outside had just decided to walk away. I didn't sleep again. By sunrise, I had packed my bag. I wasn't planning to stay the full week anymore. Something was wrong around that cabin. Something that wasn't weather or animals or my imagination. As I stepped out onto the porch, I froze. The dirt near the steps was disturbed again, but not in the random way animals move. It looked like footprints, but dragging on the toe like someone limped or pulled one foot oddly. They led into the trees behind the cabin and disappeared. I forced myself to walk to the car, trying not to look over my shoulder. Every part of my body felt watched. When I reached the driver's side door, I noticed another detail that chilled me more than the noises, more than the fabric, more than anything else. On the rear window of the car, barely visible through streaks of dust and dried rain, were the faint marks of a hand. Long fingers pressed flat, not smeared randomly, pressed calmly, intentionally. My stomach twisted. I unlocked the car, started the engine fast, and drove away faster than I should have on such a narrow road. I didn't stop until I reached the first town nearly an hour away. Only then did I pull over and breathe again. My hands were shaking. I reported what I saw at the local station. They listened, wrote notes, and said they would send someone to check the area. They didn't look surprised. That bothered me more than anything else. I never found out who had been near that cabin. The police never followed up with details. I never returned to that part of Manitoba, and now, years later, I still feel uneasy whenever I think about it. Because everything that happened was real. Every sound, Every mark, every sign was made by someone alive, someone close, someone who moved quietly in the dark while I slept a few feet away. What stays with me the most is not that they were out there. It's the clear, heavy feeling that they knew I was in that cabin before I even arrived, and they waited for night to come before stepping closer. I was 34 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small rented cabin on the northern edge of Cumbria, not far from the Scottish border. It was early October 2017, the kind of cold, damp month when the air feels heavier than usual and the daylight fades faster than you expect. I had taken time off work because my mind felt worn out. I had been living in London for too long, surrounded by noise, traffic, and people who never made eye contact. I wanted silence. I wanted space. I wanted to hear myself think again. The cabin was listed as a simple wooden structure built in the 1970s, tucked far back from a narrow road that rolled between hills. When I arrived, the sky was already turning gray, and thin lines of cold mist were slipping across the empty fields. I remember stepping out of my car and hearing nothing but the soft movement of wind through the wet grass. There were no neighbors, no farms within sight, no cars passing by. Just the old cabin, the hills, and the pale, washed-out sky. The cabin itself looked older than the photos had shown. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. Inside, the wooden floor felt uneven under my boots, and the faint smell of old smoke clung to the walls, as if hundreds of fires had been burned inside the fireplace, but no one had ever aired out the room properly. Still, it felt peaceful. It felt far away from everything I had been trying to escape. My first day was quiet. I unpacked my bag, stacked some firewood inside, and walked around the property. Behind the cabin was a small slope that led to a line of trees so old and tall that their branches twisted like dark arms above my head. The ground was cold and soft, covered in damp leaves. I tried not to think about how isolated the place was. I wanted to enjoy the solitude. I slept early that night. The only sound I heard before falling asleep was the occasional crack of wood expanding in the cold. On the second evening, something changed. I had gone for a long walk down a muddy path that ran behind the trees. It was around 5 in the afternoon when I headed back, and the sky was already losing light. I could see my breath forming small clouds in front of me. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. As I got closer to the cabin, I noticed something odd. A faint shape near the left side of the cabin, standing still near the wall. At first, I thought it was a tree stump or maybe a dark patch of shadow caused by the uneven ground. I kept walking, my boots making soft sounds against the mud. When I reached the small wooden steps leading up to the porch, I glanced again. The shape was gone. The wall was empty. I told myself it must have been nothing more than the light playing tricks on me. Inside, I warmed myself by the fireplace and tried to read. But every few minutes I felt this strange pressure in my chest, as if someone invisible was staring at me. I kept looking at the windows. They were dark now, reflecting the inside of the room like shallow mirrors. I felt like something was just outside of them, watching me. I couldn't explain why. That night I barely slept. The third day was colder. The mist never lifted, and the air felt heavier, thicker, like it wanted to press down on my skin. Around noon, I chopped wood behind the cabin. I remember the rhythm of the axe hitting the log, the echo of the sound spreading out across the empty land. It was the only noise for miles. Then I felt it. Not a sound, not a shadow. Presence. I turned around slowly, and that was the first time I saw her clearly. A woman standing near the edge of the tree line. She looked thin, almost too thin, dressed in a long dark coat that hung straight down to her knees. Her hair was long and gray, not the soft gray of age, but a dull, tangled gray that looked like it hadn't been washed in a long time. Her skin looked strangely pale, almost colorless, and even from a distance I could tell her posture was wrong. She stood too still. Not a single movement, not even from the wind pushing across the field. I froze. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. She didn't move either. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe she was a hiker. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she was from one of the farms further down the road. I tried to think of anything that made sense, but none of the explanations matched the way she stood. The position of her head slightly tilted, as if she was studying me. Before I could react, she stepped backward into the trees, disappearing behind the thick trunks with slow, stiff movements. She didn't hurry. She didn't run. She just slipped out of sight like someone fading into darkness. I felt a deep chill in my stomach. I dropped the axe without noticing. The rest of the day, I kept checking the windows. Every time I looked outside, I expected to see her standing there again, waiting. The cabin felt smaller. The walls seemed to hold in the cold instead of keeping it out. The daylight faded slowly into a dull blue, and I sat near the fireplace, unable to shake the feeling that she was somewhere close. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound. The cabin was silent at first, but after a few hours, I heard something faint outside. Soft, careful footsteps moving around the cabin, then stopping, then moving again. Not an animal, not the wind. Slow human footsteps on wet ground. I stayed completely still. My heart hammered so hard I felt it in my throat. The steps stopped near the bedroom window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited. After what felt like forever, the steps slowly moved away until I couldn't hear them anymore. I wanted to pack my bag and leave right then, but the road was dark, narrow, and surrounded by miles of empty land. I was too scared to go out. When dawn finally came, the light outside looked thin and gray, and I felt like I hadn't slept in years. I stepped outside slowly, the cold morning air hitting my face like ice. I walked around the cabin. There were fresh footprints in the mud. Small, narrow footprints. They went around the cabin in a full circle. My hands were shaking. I knew I needed to leave. I went inside and packed my things as fast as I could. I kept looking over my shoulder even though the door was closed. The fear felt too real, too heavy. As I threw my backpack into the car and slammed the door shut, I felt the urge to look toward the tree line one more time. She was standing there again. Same coat, same tangled hair, same pale skin. Her head tilted the same way as before, staring at my car like she had been waiting for me to come out. She didn't move, not even when the engine started. She just watched. I drove away faster than I should have, the tires sliding for a second on the wet mud before finding grip. I didn't look back again. I kept driving until the hills disappeared behind me and the small road turned into a wider one. By the time I reached town, the sky had cleared and the sun was breaking through the clouds. But the feeling stayed with me, sitting deep in my bones. The image of her still comes back sometimes, especially at night. Not as a shadow or a ghost or anything unreal, just a woman. A real woman. A woman who had no reason to be in those woods. Who watched me from a place where no one should have been standing. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked the owner about the property. I never even looked at photos of that area again. The ending is simple and clear. I left and I stayed away because whatever her reasons were for being there, whatever kept her watching me for those days, they were real. They belonged to the living world, not the supernatural one. And that kind of fear stays with you much longer because you know it wasn't a trick of your mind. It wasn't imagination. It was a person, a real person, and that is what makes it worse. It was the fall of 1998, and I had just turned 34. I was driving my old, beat-up Ford Ranger down a narrow dirt road in the Appalachian foothills of western North Carolina. I had been on the road for hours, leaving behind the small town of Murphy where I'd spent the last week working odd jobs, cutting firewood for some locals, and running deliveries. My plan was to get to a cabin I had rented for a week, deep in the woods near the Hiwassee River. I needed the isolation more than anything. Work had been stressful, and my girlfriend had left me 2 months prior, leaving a hollow space that I couldn't fill with anything except the hum of the engine and the cold mountain air. The dirt road twisted and dipped, lined on both sides with tall oaks and maples, their leaves turning the rich reds and oranges of autumn. The sun had dropped low behind the mountains, casting long shadows that made the road look narrower than it was. My headlights barely cut through the thickening dusk. I hadn't seen another car in at least an hour, and the quiet was heavy, almost like it was pressing down through the windshield and into my chest. I kept my hands tight on the steering wheel, glancing at the GPS, though it flickered in and out of service. It kept trying to reroute me, sometimes suggesting roads that were more like old logging paths than anything a car should be on. I passed a small creek, its surface dark and smooth, reflecting the last gold of sunlight. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves filled the cab. It was that smell that made me uneasy. I grew up around woods, and I knew that smell often came just before heavy storms or worse, trouble. I shook the thought off. I told myself I was just being tired, maybe too much coffee, too many hours on the road. After about 15 more minutes, the trees thickened. The branches arched overhead like a tunnel, blotting out the last light. My headlights illuminated patches of mist clinging low to the road. The tires crunched over loose gravel, and every time I hit a small bump, my chest jumped. I could see the outline of the cabin ahead on the map, a small wooden structure tucked into a clearing near a stand of pines. My relief was immediate but fleeting. I turned off the main road onto a narrow path that had clearly been used more by ATVs and logging trucks than cars. The ground was soft, muddy in places from recent rains, and the truck's tires slipped a few times as I navigated a sharp curve. I slowed to a crawl, listening to the crunch of sticks and leaves under the tires. The sound of the forest at night was different from day. Animals were moving. I couldn't see them yet, but I could hear the rustle of brush, the snap of twigs, the occasional bark of a distant dog, or maybe a coyote. My pulse quickened. Finally, I reached the clearing. The cabin sat crooked, weathered and dark. The paint had faded years ago, and the roof sagged in one corner. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. I could smell burning wood and pine sap. The sight made me feel a little better. At least someone had been here recently, though I had the keys and the right to be the only one here. I parked the truck and left the engine running, stretching my stiff back. The air was colder here, crisp and sharp. My breath came out in white puffs. The door creaked as I opened it. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. There was a wood stove in the corner, a kitchen area with a small sink, and a table with a couple of chairs. I threw my bag on one of them and checked the fireplace. There was enough wood stacked in the corner to get a fire going for the night. I used my lighter and matches, and after a few minutes, the room was glowing with warm light and the scent of burning pine. My nerves calmed somewhat, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching the cabin recently. I went outside to get some fresh air and stretch my legs. That's when I saw it. Faint tracks in the mud leading from the woods to the cabin. They were big, almost the size of a man's boots, but irregular, uneven. Someone had been here, but it didn't look like a casual visitor. My stomach tightened. I told myself again to calm down. Maybe it was hunters or a woodsman, someone from the nearby village. I would find out in the morning. Night came fast. The moon rose behind a bank of clouds, leaving the forest black except for the light from the cabin. The wind rustled the trees, sending leaves skittering across the clearing. I lay in the small bed, listening. Every pop of the wood stove sounded loud. Every distant thump in the woods made my heart race. I tried to convince myself it was just animals, raccoons or deer, but the tracks haunted me. I eventually drifted into a fitful sleep, dreams filled with the creak of branches and shadows moving at the edge of the clearing. I woke around 3 a.m. to the sound of the truck engine outside. My heart jumped into my throat. I lay still, straining to hear. The sound stopped. I got out of bed quietly and peeked through the grimy window. The truck was gone. I stepped outside, the cold biting through my jacket. Nothing. No footprints except mine, leading from the cabin to the clearing. I checked around the back and sides of the cabin. Nothing. The tracks I had seen earlier had vanished, as if erased by the wind or someone intentionally. I felt a wave of fear unlike anything I had ever felt in these woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed awake by the stove, sharpening my old hunting knife, checking my rifle, listening to every sound outside. By sunrise, I was exhausted but relieved to see the day. The sun hit the trees, and the forest seemed less menacing, more ordinary. I decided I had to find out what had happened. I went into the woods cautiously, following the faint impressions that were left from the night before. About 50 yards from the cabin, I found a makeshift campsite. A fire pit, a torn tent, and evidence that someone had been here very recently. Empty cans, a half-burned log, a blanket. Everything scattered like whoever had been here had left in a hurry. I spent the next hour combing the woods. I found nothing else, no person, no footprints leading further. It was as if the camper had vanished. But the deeper I looked, the more I noticed signs of human presence. A rope tied around a tree, some chopped branches, a few more random objects. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing through. They were familiar with the woods. They knew how to move without leaving a trace. That was the terrifying part. By evening, I decided to leave. I loaded the truck, started the engine, and drove back down the narrow road. The trip back was tense. I kept glancing in the mirrors, expecting to see a figure in the trees or a pair of headlights behind me. Nothing appeared, but my nerves were shredded. When I reached the main road, the world felt safer, normal even. I stopped at a gas station in Murphy, bought a soda, and sat outside, finally letting myself breathe. Looking back, I think about those woods often. I never saw anyone, never found a logical explanation. Maybe it was a drifter, maybe a hunter, maybe someone more dangerous. But I know one thing. Being alone in those mountains with someone watching makes the mind play tricks, makes ordinary things terrifying. And the truth is, some mysteries don't get solved. Some tracks in the mud just disappear, leaving you with nothing but the memory and the fear of what might have been. I never went back to that cabin. I never forgot it either, but I learned something important that week. The woods are beautiful, lonely, and full of secrets. And when you're alone, even in a place you know well, you're never as safe as you think. I had been driving for nearly 8 hours through the back roads of northern Vermont in late October of 2012, a month when the air turned crisp and the trees shed their last fiery leaves. My plan was simple: escape the city for a few days, get some work done on my laptop, and spend nights alone in the woods where the only sound would be the wind and maybe a distant owl. I didn't expect the trip to turn into one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. The last gas station had been at least 40 miles back, and my tank was low, but I told myself I could make it. The GPS had me turn off onto a gravel road that quickly deteriorated into a barely visible path. The car bounced over potholes and exposed tree roots, the tires skidding over loose stones. I couldn't see far. The late afternoon sun was fading, and the dense canopy of birch and maple trees swallowed what little light was left. I passed an old sign that read Riverside Trail, private cabin access, and thought that was where I'd be staying. The cabin appeared suddenly, half hidden by a slope and a cluster of pine trees. It wasn't much, just a single-story wooden structure, weathered to a dull gray, the kind of place that had probably seen decades of storms. There was a stone chimney with black soot stains curling up its side, and a porch sagging slightly in the middle. The windows were opaque with dirt and age, and a pair of rocking chairs sat at odd angles as if no one had touched them in years. I parked my car, the gravel crunching under the tires, and got out. The air was sharp, smelling of wet earth and rotting leaves. I carried my backpack with my laptop, some notebooks and basic supplies, canned food, water, and a small stove. As I walked toward the cabin, the forest seemed to close in behind me. Each step on the carpet of leaves sounded louder than it should, and I had a fleeting sense that I was being watched. My rational mind dismissed it. I was alone and the woods were just quiet, but the hair on the back of my neck tingled nonetheless. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and old smoke. Dust motes floated in the last rays of daylight coming through the grimy windows. The interior was surprisingly intact. A small kitchen with a rust-stained sink, a wood-burning stove with logs stacked nearby, and a living space with a tattered sofa and a few chairs. A single bedroom was in the back, the mattress stained and thin. I set my bag down, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and started a fire in the stove, the first crackling flames casting jagged shadows across the walls. Night fell quickly. By 7, it was dark enough that even the flashlight barely penetrated beyond a few feet of the cabin. I made a simple dinner of beans and rice on the small stove and sat on the floor against the sofa, staring into the fire. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling branches and whistling through gaps in the wooden walls. Occasionally, I thought I heard a snapping sound from the forest, like a branch breaking, or maybe something larger moving. My first thought was a deer or a bear, but the sound was irregular, almost like deliberate steps. I tried to focus on work, but every little sound made me pause. The wind, the branches, the occasional bird. All of it seemed amplified in the still night. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. Faint, uneven knocks coming from the far side of the cabin. 3 quick raps, then a pause, then 2 more. My heart rate quickened. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a squirrel climbing on the walls, but the timing, the pattern, made it hard to convince myself. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly moved to the door, shining the beam out into the dark. Nothing, just shadows and the outline of trees swaying in the wind. I went back to the fire, trying to ignore it, but the sounds didn't stop. If anything, they got closer, moving along the side of the cabin. I considered leaving immediately, but I realized that the car was far enough away that it would take 10 minutes just to get there, and I didn't have any cell service. My pulse raced, and I tried to rationalize. Whoever or whatever it couldn't see me through the dark. I bolted the door, stacked a chair against it, and sat down to wait for dawn. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the floor, every rustle outside, set my nerves on edge. Morning finally came, pale and gray, and I ventured outside. The forest seemed calmer, almost indifferent in daylight. The gravel road behind the cabin showed faint tire tracks from the night before, though I was certain no one else had driven in. There were no footprints near the cabin, no broken branches, just the marks from my own arrival. I inspected the porch and the windows but found nothing out of place except a single log slightly shifted near the woodpile. Still, I didn't feel safe. I decided to pack and leave, but I wanted to investigate first. I grabbed my backpack and started walking along the forest edge, scanning for any sign of someone or something nearby. About 50 meters from the cabin, I noticed deep, uneven footprints in the mud boots, large and heavy. They weren't mine, and they didn't seem fresh. but their direction suggested someone had been circling the cabin overnight. I followed them cautiously. The footprints led toward a small creek, then disappeared, leaving only scuffed leaves. That's when I understood. Someone had been here, someone who had watched me from the shadows. I hurried back to the cabin, grabbed my keys, and started the car. The engine roared to life, and I didn't look back as I drove down the winding gravel road, swerving around roots and loose rocks. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me until I reached the main road. I stopped at the next gas station, heart still pounding, and called my sister, telling her I'd be staying with her for a few days. In the weeks after, I looked up property records and discovered the cabin was technically abandoned, but had been occasionally visited by a man in his 60s who lived nearby. Neighbors said he liked to keep an eye on things in the woods, and sometimes trespassers would find themselves under his watch. I never saw him directly, but everything I experienced lined up. The knocks, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't supernatural, just a human being, lurking in the dark, claiming the woods as his own. I don't go back there anymore. I found another cabin years later, farther north, owned legitimately, with neighbors nearby and cell service. The experience taught me one thing. The woods can be quiet, beautiful, and deceptively peaceful, but they belong to someone or something, if you're not careful. And some people prefer to observe from the shadows, making sure that anyone alone learns the hard way. Even now, when I drive through northern Vermont in the fall, I glance at the tree line, remembering the gray cabin, the cracked windows, and the silent, patient presence of someone waiting in the dark. The woods themselves are harmless, but people can be far scarier. It was the summer of 2007, and I had just started my first season as a park ranger in the remote northern forests of Montana. I was 24, barely out of college, and eager to prove myself. The ranger's station was small, a cluster of weathered cabins on the edge of a dense pine forest. One of these cabins, number 6, had been assigned to me for the season. It wasn't much, a single room with a cot, a small wood stove, and a sink with a pump, but it was mine. At first, the isolation felt like freedom. I'd grown up in the city, and the thought of long hikes and quiet nights surrounded by nothing but trees was intoxicating. The first few weeks were routine. Days spent walking trails, checking for illegal hunting, and repairing signs. I was alone in the cabin most nights, and at first I loved it. I could read, write notes, and sleep without the distractions of city life. But the deeper I went into the forest during the day, the more I realized how utterly alone this place could make a person feel. The trees were thick, the terrain rough, and at night the silence was absolute. One evening, a week into July, I had just finished my rounds. The sun had dipped behind the ridges, leaving a dim orange glow through the treetops. I lit the stove in the cabin, fed it a few pieces of split wood, and sat at the small table writing reports. Outside, the wind picked up. I remember thinking how it sounded like whispers through the pine needles, a constant hiss that set my teeth on edge. I checked the cabin's locks, double-bolted the door, latched the windows, and tried to ignore the feeling of being watched that had started creeping over me over the past few days. That night, around midnight, I woke to a noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, rattling the small window panes. But then I heard it again, a crunch of dry leaves and twigs, faint but deliberate. Someone or something was moving outside the cabin. My heart slammed against my ribs. I grabbed the flashlight I kept on the shelf beside the bed and slid the door open just enough to peer outside. The forest was black, the trees tall and shadowed. I could see the faint outline of the dirt path leading away from the cabin, but nothing else. No headlights, no silhouette, just the shifting of branches. I thought it might be an animal, but the movement was too measured. It wasn't running or darting. It was pacing. I stayed up the rest of the night, listening. The rustling never stopped, though the sound never came closer than 30 or 40 feet from the cabin. By morning, it had disappeared entirely. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or some other forest creature, but the deliberate pacing didn't sit right. Over the next few days, the tension in the air didn't go away. Each night, I'd hear the same sounds, the crunching, the pacing, the occasional snap of a branch. One evening, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. I walked slowly, shining my flashlight into the trees, making sure nothing or no one was hiding. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were large, boot-shaped, but not like any hiking boot I'd seen. They were wider, heavier, pressed deep into the soft dirt and damp pine needles. They led from the tree line toward the cabin and stopped just short of the porch, then disappeared entirely. My stomach turned. I traced the prints back into the forest, but they faded into nothing. No other signs, no broken branches, no disturbed undergrowth. Just a perfect set of prints that vanished into the trees, as if someone had stepped through the air itself. I spent the next week on edge, sleeping in my clothes, keeping the stove lit all night, and keeping the door locked. I didn't leave the cabin after dark, and during the day I avoided the deeper parts of the forest. I told myself it was my imagination, stress from being alone, or perhaps a prank by one of the other rangers, but deep down I knew it wasn't. There was no logical explanation. Then, one night, the pacing came again, but this time it was closer. I heard it outside the cabin, circling, slow and methodical. I pressed myself against the wall, gripping the small hatchet I kept by the stove, heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake the forest. The cabin's thin walls offered no rail protection, and I felt it acutely. Whatever was out there knew I was inside, and for the first time I understood how vulnerable I really was. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I carefully stepped outside to inspect the area. The ground was soft from a recent rain, and the prints had returned, larger this time, leading directly to the side door. There were more this time, circling around the cabin as if the person, or whatever it was, had been watching me the entire night. And then I saw it. A small object pressed into the mud near the back of the cabin. A piece of paper soaked from the rain, but folded in a precise square. My hands shook as I picked it up. It was blank, except for a single line etched in the mud that had hardened with the paper. Asterisk, I see you. Asterisk, I left the cabin that morning. I drove back to the ranger station, 15 miles through winding dirt roads, and informed the chief that I couldn't stay there. He agreed, though reluctantly, that the cabin would remain unoccupied for a while. I never found out who or what had been circling me. No other rangers had reported seeing anything, and there was no sign of trespassers other than the footprints and that one message. Months later, I returned to the area, this time during daylight, to check some trails. The cabin was empty, quiet, and the forest had reclaimed the tracks. It looked as normal as it had before, but I couldn't go inside. Even in broad daylight, the memory of those nights lingered. There was a kind of awareness in that forest I had never felt anywhere else, a patient, deliberate observation that didn't need eyes. The thing or person had moved through the trees like it was part of the woods, and I realized I had been lucky. Now, whenever I walk a trail alone, I think back to that cabin. I remember the smell of the damp pine, the cold bite of the night air, the small noises that felt huge in the silence. And I know that some places, no matter how serene or beautiful, have a watchfulness you can't shake. That season taught me more than trail maintenance or wildlife reports. It taught me that being alone in the forest is not just about solitude. It's about awareness, humility, and a respect for the quiet things that observe without ever revealing themselves. I never returned to Cabin 6. The station eventually renovated it, installed better locks and cameras, and assigned it to another ranger the following year. I spoke to him once. He said the nights were peaceful, that nothing ever happened. I didn't tell him about the footprints, the pacing, or the note. Some things are better left unsaid. Some things are better remembered in silence. Even now, 15 years later, I drive past that forest on my way to other parks, and I feel it, the weight of watching eyes just beyond the tree line, patient, quiet, and deliberate. And I know that cabin, and the forest surrounding it, will never truly be mine again. It belongs to something else, something that waits and watches, and sometimes that's enough. I first found the cabin back in the late summer of 2013. I was 29, restless, and looking for a quiet place to think, somewhere away from the city. My life had been packed with noise and obligations for so long that even the idea of a few days in total isolation seemed like a luxury. I had driven for hours through winding back roads in northern Vermont, the kind that twist and dip under dense tree canopies, until the asphalt ended and I was on a gravel path that barely counted as a road. The GPS didn't recognize it, but I kept going. That's when I spotted the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by thick pines and maples. Weathered gray wood, some panels slightly warped, but structurally sound. The roof sagged in one corner, and moss had taken hold on the shingles. A thin trail led from the cabin to the edge of a small pond, its surface dark and still except for the occasional ripple of a fish or falling leaf. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. It was beautiful in a lonely, almost unwelcoming way. I parked my old Subaru a few yards from the porch and stepped out, my boots crunching over fallen pine needles. I spent the first few hours exploring the cabin. Inside, it was empty but intact. A single room with a small kitchen in one corner, a wood-burning stove covered in rusted soot, and a loft accessible by a narrow ladder. The floors were creaky, and the walls bore the faint, uneven scars of water damage, but nothing catastrophic. A few drawers held old cans of beans and a bag of rice, long past their prime. I decided to leave them alone. I lit a fire in the stove just as the sun dipped behind the trees, sending long shadows across the clearing. Outside, the woods began to hum with night sounds. Crickets, the occasional distant call of an owl, the low rustle of leaves when the wind picked up. I had brought my sleeping bag, a lantern, and a small cooler, but nothing else. No one knew where I was. That was the plan. I wanted isolation, and I certainly got it. The first night was quiet. I slept poorly on the loft mattress, aware of the floorboards creaking as the wind pressed against the cabin walls. I woke once to a scraping sound on the porch, but I convinced myself it was a branch brushing against the wood. Morning light made the cabin seem safer, more familiar, and I thought I had imagined the noises. The second day, I decided to explore the woods behind the cabin. I found deer tracks, a small creek, and even a fallen tree I could use to practice some basic chopping. I felt productive, almost content, until late afternoon when I noticed something odd. Footprints in the mud near the pond. They weren't mine. I froze, trying to figure out how anyone could have gotten here. There wasn't a clear road that led through the trees, only my rough track. The footprints were human, but irregular, like someone was trying not to leave a clear pattern. I chalked it up to paranoia at first. Maybe a hunter had wandered by, though I hadn't seen any vehicles and it was a long hike from any main road. Still, the sense of being watched gnawed at me. Night 2 was worse. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin and causing shadows to shift across the walls. I heard it again, the scraping, this time more deliberate, coming from the side of the cabin. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the door, ready to confront a wild animal or a careless hunter. Outside, nothing moved. The trees swayed in the wind, and the pond was calm. Still, I felt eyes on me. I spent the next day in a tense state, checking the perimeter and barricading the windows as best I could. The footprints hadn't returned, but I found other signs. Broken branches, a rustling in the underbrush that stopped the instant I looked. Felt like someone was moving just beyond my sight, observing, testing. By the fourth day, I realized this wasn't going to end well if I stayed put. I couldn't tell if the person or people were dangerous, but the uncertainty was worse than any immediate threat. I packed up what I could, leaving the rest. I had to get back to civilization. I started walking down the gravel path, hoping to reach a main road within an hour or two, but the woods seemed to stretch endlessly. The sun was low, and shadows became long fingers stretching across the path. I began to notice faint markers, scratches on trees, small piles of rocks, footprints that weren't mine. My pace quickened. My heart raced. Every snapping twig made me jump. Then I heard voices, low and indistinct, but unmistakably human. I froze, pressing myself against a tree. I couldn't see them, but the sound came from deeper in the woods, moving slowly and deliberately. I knew the cabin had been discovered. They had followed my tracks. Panic took over. I ran blindly, twisting through the trees, tripping over roots and rocks, until I stumbled into a clearing and saw the gravel path again. I ran to my car, found the keys on the ground where I'd left them, and slammed the doors shut. I started the engine and didn't stop until I reached a town miles away, lights glowing through the dusk. I pulled into a diner and tried to explain myself, but it came out in a jumble of breathless words. No one had seen anything unusual. They didn't believe me. I didn't care. I just needed to be safe. Weeks later, I learned from a local ranger that the cabin had been abandoned for decades, though people occasionally squatted there. Sometimes hikers or hunters would find evidence of others staying illegally, but they never knew who. The footprints, the sounds, the subtle markers in the woods, they were signs someone else had been there. Someone who didn't want to be seen but was tracking me, testing the cabin's privacy. I never went back. I never wanted to. That experience stayed with me for years. The fear wasn't in ghosts or spirits. It was the reality of another human being, unseen and patient, capable of stalking without leaving anything definitive. It made me hyper-aware of the solitude I sought. It taught me that isolation in the wilderness wasn't comforting. It was dangerous if someone else knew where you were. Now, when I drive past northern Vermont, I keep my eyes on the road, the forest stretching endlessly beside me. I think about the cabin sometimes, about how small I felt in those woods, about the person who might still be out there, marking the trees, leaving traces for the next visitor. I never stayed in another isolated cabin after that summer, and I never will. The wilderness, I realized, has its own rules, and one of them is simple. You are never truly alone, and sometimes that alone is far scarier than any ghost.